Sorry. Okay, aloha everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Joe Kent. I'm the Vice President of Research at the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. The Grassroot Institute is a nonprofit public policy think tank that seeks to educate people about the values of individual liberty, economic freedom, and accountable government. And ooh, this mic is kind of hot, huh? And we have a lot more sandwiches. We bought too many sandwiches today, so you're welcome to get some. Dr. Keli'i Akina is the president of the Grassroot Institute. His flight was delayed today, so he'll be joining us maybe in 10 minutes or so. So I'm just giving this introduction. And today we're going to talk about a topic that affects everyone in the state. Hawaii's employee retirement system services over 135,000 members across the state. We're talking about government workers and taxpayers contribute money into the retirement system to ensure that state retirees get the retirement that was promised to them. Unfortunately, there's this sort of crisis situation, which is that the pension system has an unfunded liability of $12 billion. So Grassroot has talked a lot about this problem, and but there is one man who is trying to help fix the crisis situation in Hawaii and make good on the promises to public workers. Tom Williams is the executive director of the Employees Retirement System of the state of Hawaii. Mr. Williams came to Hawaii in 2015, I believe, and previously he was the executive director of the Wyoming retirement system. So won't you welcome Mr. Tom Williams.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I'm afraid to touch the mic because you indicated it's a little warm, a little hot. But in any case, one of the ways I propose we address this $12 billion unfunded liability is start passing around the plate. So for those of you who are members of the system, a little small contribution, but we'll invest it wisely. No, that really won't work. But look, I'm really delighted for the invitation to be here by Keli'i Akina and the Grassroots Institute. Joe in particular, we've talked for on a number of occasions about their interest in getting an update on the status of the employees' retirement system. And as was suggested, I've had a little bit of experience in the context of public pension plans. I worked for a couple, almost 3 decades with the world's largest private pension fund, TIA, Craft for Colleges and Universities, and managed most of their operations across the U.S. I spent some time developing real estate, and when the real estate markets went crazy in 2008, 2009, I decided to get back into the pension business, and I had actually semi-retired, and I had an opportunity to manage the assets for the Wyoming retirement system. It's about a $7.5 billion fund. I did that for about 5 years, in fact, and sort of semi-retired again. And then I wasn't really enjoying myself terribly being semi-retired, and an opportunity arose here. It was really happenstance. I was cleaning out my office. I had these pension and investment magazines, and I had accrued about 3 or 4 of them, but I felt an obligation to kind of go through them before I recycled them, and I was going through them very, very rapidly, and I passed this ad for the executive director here. And I actually have a young daughter who, when I mentioned that Hawaii was an opportunity, I couldn't turn back at that juncture because she began to tell all of my neighbors that we were moving, and I hadn't even applied. So, but that's the way it works. Again, the title "Crisis Averted." I think we have, in fact, averted a crisis here in Hawaii, but there is also a crisis more significantly around the nation as it relates to the management of these public retirement programs, but the availability of retirement plans in general, even in the private sector. Now, we averted our crisis here, I think, in a number of different ways. Back in 2012, I believe there was an effort at pension reform. We established a so-called new tier of benefits so that new employees, new hires in the state get lesser benefits, a lower multiplier, if you will. They contribute more to the system. it takes longer for them to vest. For example, most state employees vested after 5 years, new employees vest after 10 years in the system. That's a big move to address the unfunded liability going forward, but it does little, if anything, to address the existing unfunded liability, because that's made based on the promises that have been made to the existing employees. And so nothing changed for the existing employees. They continue to accrue benefits at the pre-reform rates, and that's going to continue to sort of flow through the system for the next 40, 50, 60 years or more as people retire and live for a very, very long time here in Hawaii, the highest longevity of any state in the nation by far. So that impacts our pension payouts significantly. But that change was important, and more recently, I guess a year ago, the organization assumed new, more conservative investment return assumptions. You know, pension plans had been assuming they'd get 7, 8%, 9% a year, and that's been gradually coming down. And we lowered our earnings assumption in a conservative way to about 7%. We think it's realistic, but it results in about a 50-50 chance that you're going to make it. Which in terms of probability is not a really bad one, but everything has to go right in order for us to be sort of out of the woods as it relates to these unfunded liabilities and to address them. And so we can talk a little bit down in the program about some of the things that are available to us for discussion. These are not recommendations, but I'll reflect and share with you some of the things that other funds are engaged in, because all around the country, these public pension funds have experienced some of the same circumstance, some of the same hardship, because they were immature plans, they had assets that exceeded liabilities. It was fairly easy to invest the money. You could invest in bonds and you could achieve a 7 or 8% return. It's significantly more difficult to accomplish that today, and I've got some slides that will show you why that's the case. But, while it is costly to fund these retirement programs, they do create a significant benefit, and we'll talk about that as well. We, I think, take in about $975 million a year in terms of contributions between employers and employees. We pay out about $1.3 billion in benefits to our members. And so what that translates to is that for every dollar in benefits that we pay, about 60 to 70% of those dollars come from the investment earnings. So contributions are important, but it's the earnings on those contributions over protracted periods, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that really generates the majority of the benefit payment. And that has a very positive effect throughout the entire economy, and it creates stability in the economy even during down periods. So when there are recessions, what you'll find is that these public pension plans continue to provide reliable benefits, sustaining and supporting the economic growth. And of course, the role that they play in the context of financial security for the members cannot be understated. It's so vitally important, as I understand it, because the vast majority of working Americans today don't have pensions. I think 45% of all Americans, all workers, have zero, nothing saved for retirement. Another third of workers have indicated that they'd have to take a loan if they experienced an unexpected expense of $200 a month. Actually just have to take a loan. And there are an awful lot of statistics in support of this. And the workers are living actually day to day. And so I think it's important for us to provide these public pension plans because it's an efficient way of delivering these benefits, and we can talk about why it is efficient and how it is efficient. But at some point, we all pay. And you can pay through increased social services and health, drains on Medicare and Medicaid and hospitals for the uninsured. It's no real way to get around this. And historically, there were these three important components of a retirement fund. It was the Social Security to generate about a third. The public pension, or the private pension, if you will, was to generate another third. and then, of course, your personal savings. And it's very difficult for folks to set aside monies in personal savings when wages are stagnant and you're at a place with such a significant cost of living as it is in Hawaii. Social Security is not intended to provide a significant portion, just a third for lower income workers. And the private pension is the real core. And the private pension for most non-public workers has gone away. Most profit-making entities don't offer pension plans anymore. They've done away with the DB plans. They've gone to defined contribution or 401k plans. There's a lot of data that suggests that those have proven inadequate to provide meaningful levels of retirement income in retirement. So I think that that's a crisis that is rolling down the track, and that as more and more Americans, working Americans, approach retirement without any income or adequate income to support them and their beneficiaries, we're going to have some significant challenges across the country. But I do want to just say, having worked with Dr. Akina and Joe Kent and his colleagues, I'm delighted to be here. I don't want this to be entirely sort of a dissertation from me. I know that there are some questions that many of you have, and I would encourage you to ask those as we go through the process. I sort of mentioned, and Joe mentioned some of this in the context of the program itself. It was established in 1925. We've got 8 trustees. 4 of them are elected by our membership, and in fact there's a trustee election going on right now. There are 3 candidates that were nominated by various employer groups, the unions in particular, and there's some information, a modest amount of information on those candidates in a newsletter that I have copies of available here. It's called a Holamua. It's the quarterly newsletter that we publish, but it's here, and it has some profiles of some of the members. And it also has an interesting article on the Kanapali golf course, because I'm here to begin some discussions, at least direct discussions on behalf of the ARS with stakeholders here in Maui who are concerned about the possible redevelopment of that particular project. But let's see what happened to my, maybe my setting things on top of the, yeah, let's see here. I think we can use the slides here. Oh, that's not good.
Sorry about that.
No, I think probably I did something. There it is. Okay, we were talking about the 135,000 members. That's about 9% of the population here. And I think when you consider the average family size is about 2.8, I just rounded up to 3. We are at least about, almost a quarter of the population is directly affected by the ERS benefits. They're in households that actually receive those benefits. So again, a big impact across the state. The economic benefits, each dollar paid out in pension benefits, there's a multiplier effect. Each dollar ends up generating at least $100.28 in total output. And we show here in the bottom bullet, each dollar invested by Hawaii taxpayers, you put in $1, you get this $4.35 out, and that relates primarily to the impact on the economies as well as the impact on those investment earnings. Assets of last year, June 30th of 2016, we had an accrued liability, $27.4 billion. And that's the total of all of the commitments that we made, the promises that we've made for services that our membership have rendered. And then, of course, we're to have monies, assets to pay those liabilities. And of course, there's a mismatch right there, because we had $14.9 billion in assets. It's now about $16 billion because of positive market performance. But back as of June 30th, our fiscal year, we had an unfunded liability of $12.4 billion. And that's fairly substantial. It leaves us with a funded ratio of 54.7%. And that's not healthy. Healthy pension plans are generally viewed to be about 80% funded and moving forward. If you can move around that number a little bit, but once you get in the 60% range and below, it becomes dicey because we're a mature plan. As I said, we pay out more in benefits than we're receiving in contributions. and that puts pressure on investments, and of course that results in this liability asset mismatch. Expected investment return, we lowered that, as I alluded to moments ago, from 7.55% down to 7%, and that was one of the major reasons for the increase in the unfunded liability, because we had a lower discount rate. It means that the investments grow at a lower pace, if you will. The liabilities are the liabilities because they grow based on the years of service and the payroll and all of that. But this assumed investment return change resulted in about $2 billion increase in the unfunded liability. There was also an additional $2 billion increase resulting from mortality improvements, because we looked at actual mortality statistics for our membership here in Hawaii, and we know that they live longer than any state or any population in the U.S. by far. 2.5, 3.5 years in some instances, and women tending to live a little bit longer than the men. Yes?
I just want to try to break it down, help break it down for everyone and for myself.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the factors that contributed to the unfunded liability, and you're saying that people are living longer, and that contributes to the unfunded liability, and also is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. You know, we start with an assumption that you're going to have X amount of dollars in benefits, and that we're going to pay those out for a specific predictable number of years, and those numbers of years of payout get increased, and we've now adopted new dynamic mortality tables that you don't just look at every 5 or 10 years. They have increases built in them every year, and we call them again, dynamic multi-general mortality tables. So yes, the increase in mortality, longevity, means we pay benefits for longer than we had anticipated, and that increases the liability. It's going to be difficult for you to see because I'm standing up here and I can hardly see it, but this is the investment results. We said for the fiscal year ending June 30th. What we see here, of course, is that we had a 13.4% return for the fiscal year, which was very, very good. It exceeded our peers and our policy benchmarks. And you can see here the returns for the 1, 3, 5 year, and 10 years. So 1 year 13.4, 3, 5, 5, 5 year 9.2. The 5 year exceeds the 7%, but the 10 year was only 5.3. And that's particularly endpoint sensitive because it incorporated the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. After 2018 or so, that'll drop off and you'll see much improved numbers. But we've been doing pretty well. I alluded to this slide a little bit earlier about the increasing complexity of the investment program. And it's, again, probably difficult for you to see, but what this shows is 1995 in the left column, the center is 2005, and then 2015. And so if you had an expected return of 7.5%, it's shown down here at the bottom, the 7.5% return. In 1995, you could have accomplished that with just bonds. You didn't have to take very much risk at all. You could have used governmental and corporate bonds. Simple. But by 2005, in order to achieve that 7.5%, you had to end up with a more complex plan. You had U.S. large cap stocks, small cap, global equities, real estate, private equity, and at those particular ratios. But importantly, what you have to observe as well is the standard deviation, which is that bottom line, is the measure of risk. It went from 6% to 8.9% over that 10-year period. So it was more complex mix of assets in order to achieve a return, and you're introducing more risk to the plan. In 2015, you can see appreciably more complex to achieve that 7.5% return, and the volatility is now 3 times. It's now 17.2%. Yes, sir.
Can you explain why that standard deviation number is an indicator of risk?
Well, it supposedly relates to volatility of returns. And you're looking at the returns, the standard ratio of certain types of strategies to others. And so volatility is the classic measure of risk, the volatility in the return. And so the volatility in the return of bonds is fairly low because the return differential doesn't range so terribly much. But as you can get to equities, it gets higher, so there's more risk. And then the more complex equities, when you get into private equity and these other types of investments, it introduces even more volatility, i.e. more risk. And so the riskiness of the plan has necessarily, not because you wanted to introduce risk, but in order to achieve a given return, you had to create this level of portfolio structure. So it requires expertise in the context of our investment professionals and our managers that wouldn't have been required, say 15 years prior.
Can I just, one more, I just really want to understand that slide. So are you saying that in 1995 it was 100% bonds?
No, it was 100%. Oh yeah, in 1995. Not our program was. I'm suggesting that you could have achieved a 7.5% return with just bonds in 1995. So I don't know what our portfolio consisted of in 1995, but I know we were close to being fully funded. We were closer to like 96% funded as opposed to the 54.7% that we are at today. And this shows the growth in the actuarial accrued liability from 2005 through 2016. It was $4 billion back in 2005. And you can look at some events like 2009, and the liability went up dramatically to 8 billion, 8.2. And then with the changes that were made in investment assumptions and the like, it went to 12.4 in 2016. And the funded ratio did the opposite. So the liabilities are going up, the funded ratio declined from where back in 1997, we looks like we were about 91, 90. In 2000, we were about 94, 95% funded. And now today we're at 54.7% funded. And part of the reason for this significant liability relates to the failure of the legislature to make contributions that were required to the plan. Monies, when we earned, or the plan earned, returns in excess of the assumed, they were diverted to the general fund. And so that was to the tune of about $1.7 billion over a 32-year period. And an actuarial study had suggested that if we hadn't done that, we'd be close to full funding even today, even after the great financial crisis. But you can't unring that bell.
The previous slide, you said billion, but on the side it says billions.
This slide?
Yes.
Yeah, well, if it says millions, these are billions.
Okay.
These are actually billions of dollars in unfunded liability. Yes, sir.
I'm having a hard time understanding the accrued liability, because 135,000 is about $1 million for 12 billion. Are you saying that each retiree is going to consume almost $1 million?
Oh, I'd say yes.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. You mean pay a retiree a benefit on average? I think the average benefit's about $28,000 a year. And our retirees are living 35 and more years in retirement. And that's just the average. And we have benefits that are, $120,000 a year and more. So, I mean, the average is sort of a lowball estimate, quite frankly. But yes, the liability is very accurately calculated based on our actual membership, and it's changed every year based on the actual payroll growth, the extra years of service they've accrued. So I wish it were not the case, but it is. Employer contribution rates. I mentioned that the crisis was averted in part by an increase in contributions. That increase in the unfunded liability changed our funded date, the time to full funding, from 30 years, which the legislature mandates that it has to be a minimum of 30 years, can't exceed it. It went to 66 years. So when that happens, we go to the legislature and says, what do you need in order to get it back to within a 30-year funding time frame? And that was contribution increases that will change the general employee increases from 17% to 24%. It's over a 4-year period they're being phased in, but that's a 42%, I think, increase in general employee employer paid contributions. So the employer is paying this. So it went from 17 to 24% over this 4-year period. It's being phased in. And police and fire have a contribution that went from 25% actually, to 41%, a 65% increase. Yes, Joe?
When you say employer, you're talking about like the police department, the employer, or Maui County, the employer, or like the individual policeman is paying more?
Well, the employer in this instance is all of the cities and the counties and the state. The employee contribution was not increased under the legislation, and that was a decision that the legislature made. Many programs have increased the participation level of employees. They require a little more contribution, share in the cost of the funding the unfunded liability. In this instance, the state just laid that burden, if you will, on the employers. But it's all state employees, all city and county of Honolulu, Maui, all those state and city and county workers. So, you know, this is a massive, massive increase. I mean, when you think 42, 65%, if you think about the impact of that level of increase on your household, if your expenses had gone up by that amount of money, how would you handle it? And obviously, it's necessary in order to address this unfunded liability. But at the same time, we know over time, it really crowds out other goods and social services that are required, whether it's education or roads or hospitals or you name it. So there are limited revenues available, and these are commitments that have been made that need to be paid. But when you've missed a number of those payments, this is the dramatic impact that it has, is you have to make it up by increased contributions later on. Yes, sir.
Fire and police increase at a higher rate?
Well, the police and fire increase at a higher rate because we account for their liabilities separately. They have a separate plan, quite frankly. They have a different benefit multiplier. They can retire at an earlier age. I think historically the police and fire were presumed to be able to work literally no more than, say, age 50, 55. But you know, due to increases in safety equipment and other practices, the police and firemen are living significantly longer. But it's a benefit formula. They get more benefits, and therefore it costs more to provide those benefits for police and fire. Also, we can talk a little bit about elements that are incorporated into compensation. Some of it's like overtime. And so police and fire tend to accrue more overtime than other groups of employees. And so that too can add to their increased pension costs.
And then don't the police and fire contribute more?
The employees contribute more and the employers contribute more. Yeah, but we didn't, or the legislature didn't change the employee contribution this time out. They changed only the employer contributions. This was a projection back in 2016 when I told you our unfunded liability was going to go off the charts, and it would take 66 years in order to fully amortize it. The top line shows what the unfunded liability from 12.4 and how it would have grown into 2051 to over $45 billion, quite frankly. But with the contribution increase, the bottom line shows you how that unfunded liability will continue to grow for several years, but then begin to decline, and it should be fully funded by 2046. And that's the power of the contribution increase.
As I understand it, the legislature took money from the employee retirement system 2 times, and they were never asked to return it. So why was that? And is that the reason for the unfunded liabilities stretching out to 66 years?
Well, the unfunded liability the numbers of occasions on which the legislature diverted money that would have been in the fund, I'm unsure of. I think it's actually more than two. I think that I was told that it was over a 37-year period. And there were different sums each year because, for example, if the fund had assumed 8% return, if it earned 10%, that 10% would not be contributed to the fund in the next year. They would reduce their required contributions by that excess. So there was never a cushion created in the assets of the plan. So when there is a downturn in the market, you had no cushion because assets go up and down. But if you take out all the ups, you create more likelihood of downturns in the market. So yeah, I don't know how many times that happened, but that's the history as I'm told, that it happened a number of times. And this is the impact of the higher contribution rates. The lower line, if we didn't get the contribution rates and how it impacts the funding level. The upper line is with the new contribution rates, again showing at 2041 that we'd be near full funding and that the normal cost then applies, and that's about 9%. So employer and employee costs will go down dramatically once the unfunded liability is addressed. And this is the statutory employer rate, I believe for both the, this is just for the combined statutory employer rate for all employees as well as the so-called normal cost. And if we weren't funding unfunded liability, the lower green bars is what the contribution levels would be today. And that's what they would be in 2042. It's down about 5 or 6%. But the increase that we see now is related to those unfunded liabilities. Combined liabilities, a gentleman had asked earlier about the medical plan. We're not part of, nor are we responsible for the liabilities of the medical plan. That's the Employer Union Trust, EUTF. But they're a big state entity, and they too have unfunded liabilities. We have actuarial accrued liabilities of $27 billion. They have 13, combined 40 for the state. Assets, we had $15 billion approximately. They had $1 billion. So $16 billion in assets to offset $40 billion in liabilities. Underfunded actuarial liabilities, $24.6 billion and a 39.6% combined funded ratio for those two plans. They're not combined in any way. The ERS is 54, and obviously the EUTF is only 8.5% funded. So combined contribution rates, this is what the contribution rates look like if you add the retirement plan and the health insurance plan. And those contributions are very, very, hello, Dr. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. And as you can see, these contribution levels are at or above 50%, and they stay that way until 2045, 2046. And again, it's difficult to know whether state revenues are going to be able to keep up with the level of unfunded liabilities. Because the revenue, I think, is, and I'm no revenue expert, but I know there's been some concern expressed as to whether the expected increase in revenues will be able to keep pace with the growth in the unfunded liabilities. Crisis averted. This is a sort of a stoplight graphic that tends to show when plans are in trouble. And our program, as I would think, is right in the middle. We're in the caution area. We think we've made the kind of adjustments that are going to lead to full funding, but it requires, as I said a little earlier, for a lot of things to go right. We have to have investment markets that deliver to us over this protracted period a 7% return. And we've had an extraordinary period of market growth, a bull market for the last 10 or so years. There's an inevitable business cycle and a downturn that's going to occur. And when we don't earn as much as we propose, liabilities go up. So they'll fluctuate. But we're taking some steps in terms of the investment program to reduce the risk in the program, and I can talk about that. But it shows that the green light here, that if you're 80 to 100% fully funded, you're in pretty safe position, quite frankly. But if you're in the 0 to 20% range, you're essentially in a pay-as-you-go. You really don't have any assets to cover your unfunded liabilities. And of course, then there's the range in between. So we're right there in the middle, but moving toward green if everything goes the way we hope. I mentioned the new tier of benefit. These are some things that I'm not recommending, but other plans around the country look at. Lower benefit multipliers. We did that for new employees. Sometimes plans are doing that for existing employees. It can occur in some jurisdictions, not in others, because I think in Hawaii, benefits are constitutionally guaranteed. There is a non-impairment clause as it relates to service already rendered. Now, the question arises as to whether you can change things for service going forward. That hasn't been tested here. No one's asked that particular question, but that's one of the ways that many plans around the country who find themselves in difficult positions address the unfunded liability. And to the extent that the legislature and others want to talk about these and other ideas, our board is interested in having that conversation. But it really will involve the entirety of the stakeholders, the employees, the unions, the legislatures, and want input from all. Higher vesting and age requirements, we mentioned those as taking place already. For new hires, higher member contributions. We increase employer but not employee contributions. That's an option for some plans and is one for ours should it be elected. Post-retirement benefits. I think many of you know that we have post-retirement adjustments that retirees get. I think in the older plan about 2.5% in benefit increase each year in retirement. That's a very costly benefit. A lot of programs have reduced that or tie the payment of these cost of living adjustments to the health of the plan. So if the plan's got solid funding, they pay the benefits out. If they don't have solid funding, they hold back, and it's called gain sharing or risk sharing. But again, that's not a part of our program today. But one of the things we wanted to talk about, and the Grassroots Institute asked me, is to say, what are other funds doing? What are some of the programs doing to mitigate the risk of the plan that's represented by this unfunded liability? Employer payments for pension spiking. I think we just talked about overtime being used as a compensation component. Well, one of the big problems is we assume what your salary is going to be, and we think it's going to grow at 3.5% a year, but then what we find is that in the last couple of 3 years of a person's employment, maybe it increases 25% or 30% as a result of overtime. And then that benefit, which is based on your highest 3 years average salary, is dramatically higher than it would have otherwise been. And we haven't funded for it. So that too adds substantially to the unfunded liability. Now there was an effort, and is an effort in place to eliminate overtime in the context of this new generation of workers after 2012. But it still exists for the earlier generation of workers. Now we try to put in a spiking fee so that when there are these egregious levels of spiking, we charge the employer. The intent is to discourage the support for pension spiking. But there still is a considerable amount of it that goes on, and spiking below the threshold level is not reimbursed, is not compensated by the fund. So that's also a source of liabilities for the program. Overtime included in compensation. Also, I think one of the features of our plan is we allow sick leave, unused sick leave, to be converted to service. And many programs do or don't employ that level of conversion because the state has paid for that benefit in the first instance, and then you get to convert it from sick leave into a lifetime income with the state and the fund making a guarantee of those benefits for the rest of their life. So plan design changes. We talked about compensation, average fine and compensation, this unused sick leave, post-retirement. These are all things that we've just talked about. Disassociation costs is the last item there. And that perhaps has some relevance for you here in Maui because there was a hospital privatization. I believe Kaiser took over the management of a couple of the island's hospitals. Those employees, 1,500 employees approximately, were members of the ERS. And they're making contributions into the system, and those contributions go to pay toward the unfunded liability and the benefits for new hires and the like. The loss of those people left us with about a $280 million increase in our unfunded liability because it took people out of the system who would have been contributing toward the unfunded liability. And so one of the things that we attempt to do is to communicate the entire cost of legislative changes to the legislature so that when they're looking at the value of a particular activity, whether it's privatization, that they look at the impacts not only in terms of operating costs, but the impacts to the pension fund as well. There is a moratorium on benefits that's been in place for a number of years. In fact, the legislature passed a law that said there would be no increases in benefits until the ERS is fully funded. And, but that hasn't been strictly adhered to. There are a number of ways in which I have observed and others have observed small increases in benefits for different groups of employees, cancer presumptions, or expanded cancer presumptions, and quite a few others. So, but if we're going to stabilize the fund, we've got to be serious about not increasing benefits, because every increase in benefit comes with a corresponding increase in liability and contribution requirements. So we encourage compliance with the statute as it's currently written. So some administrative initiatives that we're talking about are related to the budget and the investment staff. For the most part, I don't believe that we've got a lot of capacity to increase contributions beyond where we are. The benefits are what the benefits are. I mentioned investment earnings as playing a key role. I think we need to invest a bit in our investment team and its capacity because it has an outside impact on the returns of the fund. It's demonstrated that one of the greatest risks to achievement of full funding is the attraction and retention qualified investment staff. And particularly that's important with the complexity of the investment environment that I showed you that has changed from 1995 through 2015 and is expected to get even more complex going forward. Yes?
Well, I want to give time for people to ask questions as well. So, but first I want to introduce Dr. Keli'i Akina. He's the president and CEO of the Grassroot Institute and a trustee at large in the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And he'll take us through some Q&A.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Let's give Tom a round of applause.
All right, thank you guys. Keli'i, thank you.
Well,
Thank
sorry
you.
to cut you off there, Tom.
No, not at all.
Let you finish up what you were about to say in a bit.
Yeah.
No.
But everyone, Thomas Williams has done a wonderful job in his role of coming into the ERS and leading it. And we're delighted that he's willing to work with us here at the Grassroot Institute. So thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. In a moment or two, I'll let you have at him and ask any questions you want of him about the ERS. But first, let me say a couple of things. I hope that you can understand how important it is to fight for good government. And we are in this process together. And I want to point out that Joe Kent is your director here on the island of Maui for Grassroot Institute. Give him a hand. Thanks for putting this event together. And on staff, Sean Mitsui over here, whom you may have met at the door. We appreciate you very much. Tom and everybody, I apologize for being late. This is one of those rare occasions where Hawaiian Airlines was late. About almost 2 hours, my plane was delayed due to this weather. So certainly, Tom, I think you and I are going back together tonight. And if not, one of these fine folks here will probably put us up.
Thank you. I look forward.
You know, our attention to the ERS has been long at the Grassroot Institute. We've been concerned about the quality of our state government budget. And one of the things that has been a great deal of our research has been the unfunded liabilities. But I was very pleased that Tom had followed our research and was aware of some of the things we've done in terms of the gaming that goes on in terms of pensions. And when we sat down together in his office on Oahu, I just sensed a real openness as a government servant. He was really transparent, really willing to talk about it, and I learned a lot from him. So I want to encourage you to ask whatever questions you'd care to ask of Tom. And Tom, I'll welcome you back up here, and I'm going to start by asking you a question.
Indeed, please.
We had an interesting conversation. we don't fill rooms like we do tonight here with boring titles. So at first I thought of saying, you'll come here tonight and talk about our pension system from crisis, which is always a good word to get people to come, from crisis to solutions. And that echoes the fact that we pointed out that we were in a situation of $12 billion of unfunded liabilities. But you had a better insight. You said, maybe it's not from crisis to solution, but crisis averted. I wonder if you'd explain that.
I actually talked a little bit about this at the beginning of my commentary and suggested that absent the changes that took place in 2012, the creation of a new tier of benefits, a less generous tier of benefits, as well as the contribution increases, the lowered assumed investment return, and the more conservative mortality assumptions that were adopted a year ago. Those are the things that put our plan on a footing toward full funding. It's not a guarantee that we'll get there, but if everything goes as actuarially planned and as investments are scheduled to generate, then those are the things that will fully fund us over time. Those are the things that will avert the crisis. But I think, again, I mentioned that there is a crisis, a larger one, and that relates to the national absence of savings for retirement. And so that one hasn't been averted, and it may be getting worse, in fact.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question as you get yourselves ready. A lot of times we think of the ERS kind of the way we think of universities. Many people think what funds universities is the tuition money that goes in. Sometimes people think that what funds the pension system is the contributions of the employees that go in. And they certainly do to some extent. But one of the things that I enjoyed talking with Thomas about in his office was another aspect that really funds the benefits. The vast majority of benefits, and he made some reference to this, is paid for by the earnings of the trust fund. The money goes into a trust that is managed, and that trust pays for about 70+% of all the benefits. And when we realize that, we have a totally different view of what the ERS is. The ERS is not just a piggy bank into which you put money and then you break it someday in order to get money. And what this means is that we may have a means of being able to enhance the power of this ERS and overcome the unfunded liabilities if we can improve the investment capacity. But one of the interesting things that Thomas shared with me is that our legislators don't always see it that way. And sometimes the plea for more workers to handle the investments and so forth is seen as perhaps overhead. Tom, I wonder if you'd address a bit the investment potential of the ERS if we have the resources to really build it.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. And I think everything that Keli'i has commented, I echo entirely. It is fairly common around the country that legislators who oversee public pension plans oftentimes view them almost like any other state agencies. They look at all state agencies as relative consumers of revenue. Their resources, fiscal resources, and the agencies eat more than they return in some respects. And so most have a view of the agencies, whether they're healthcare or otherwise, to try to contain the cost of those, to limit the growth in those particular assets. But the ERS is a net contributor. We produce money. We obviously bring money in and we invest it, but we generate significantly more than we bring in terms of those investment results. And as the doctor suggested, 70% of every benefit dollar we pay comes from those investments. And so I think it wasn't so many years ago, the ERS had no investment professionals internal. I think the decisions were made primarily by external consultants and the executive director. And they did a good job because it wasn't that complicated back then. You could do all bonds and you could really get the return. But over time, that challenge has grown significantly more complex. We've grown our staff, but it's really, I think, in my own mind, under-resourced in terms of its opportunities, because there's technology, there's data, there's information that if our people are able to better employ it in the decisions they make, in selection of managers, in the diversification of our portfolio, and the purchase and sale of assets, it can accrue to the benefit of the fund. But it requires the system be viewed as an entity into which you want to invest money, because you're going to get a return on that investment, as opposed to viewing it primarily as a net consumer of state resources.
Right. And that's good news, because we have greater capacity to overcome the unfunded liabilities if we develop our investment side. Now, before I open it up to questions, how many of you are members of the ERS? Fantastic. So you are vested stakeholders, and even if you're not, you're a stakeholder in case it doesn't go right. But who'd like to ask a question? Go ahead and just raise your hand. Yes, if you just stand up and shout your name out.
Hi, Tamara.
Tamara?
I know,
Aloha.
Aloha. I know we talked about this earlier, but I just was wondering if this $343 million number, I mean, you might not know the answer right now, but is that representative of the 7% that you said that we need a minimum of for this redevelopment?
Well, let me
Tom,
try
could
to
you use the mic?
Okay. Yeah, let me try to put this into context. There's a news article of which we have a quarterly newsletter. There are some copies available to you. There is a golf course that the ERS owns, Royal Kanapali Golf Course. It was not an intentional investment of the ERS. It was actually acquired in foreclosure, as I understand it. It was collateral. That when there was this foreclosure, we got a golf course, and we've held on to for it a number of years, and we've been, we think, good stewards of it. But one of our challenges is to invest all of our monies in the best interest of our members and beneficiaries, and to that end, we're beginning to explore options as to the revitalization or redevelopment of Kanapali, and that's evoked, understandably, a great deal of interest on behalf of the neighbors and the community and the island more broadly. And I really support that, and we want to create a dialogue. In the article that is being alluded to by Tamara is a $343 million figure that some have suggested is the value, if you will, of the entire development when it was completed. That it would cost would create value of $340 million, or cost approximately that much. That's not an accurate figure, because we haven't finished any development plans at all, and the ERS has not invested any of its assets in the redevelopment of Kanapali, apart from investments in some consulting services and the efforts to create an environmental impact statement, and I think the necessary permitting so that we can move forward with the process. But one of the things that I've conveyed tonight is a strong willingness on behalf of ERS to be on the ground here and to listen to and be a part of this dialogue as it relates to the challenges that this opportunity represents for members here and some not represented here. But we're very interested in having that dialogue, and we've got a couple of folks here, Gwen Rivera and Michael Munikio, who are local and consultants to the ERS as it relates to the project. And I hope you'll have an opportunity, they're here when I'm not, to convey your concerns, your thoughts, your questions to them. And there is a regular communication, I think weekly conference calls, and we have a November 3rd meeting in Oahu that we're going to be updated again on these things. But that's a number if, in fact, the entire development were to be created or finished as proposed there, with housing and retail and, you know, golf club and a number of other amenities, that it might cost as much as that, but we've not spent anything like that.
I think you have a quick follow-up. Go ahead.
So if this isn't the number, do you know the 7% number, or could you get back to us what the 7%?
Oh, the 7% is our assumed investment return. That underlies our financing of the system, the funding, the liabilities. In order to figure out what we owe and how much we've made, we start off with an assumption. And we assume that we're going to earn 7%. So the 7% has nothing to do with that number there. That is detached from, has no relationship to the Kanapali golf course. That's the entirety.
What to me to be fiduciary responsible to the ERS members?
Oh, okay. Well, generally, one has to achieve its assumed return. So, we try to invest in broad with a variety of instruments that collectively will generate that 7%, if not a bit more than that. So, if we're earning nothing on an investment, it's not really good for the fund. It's not helping the fund at all. And it really helps the fund most precisely if we earn 7% or more on it. Anything less, we've undershot our assumptions. Anything more, we've met our assumptions and maybe even a little bit over.
Very good. I think there was a question next to Tamara back there earlier. Oh, over here, yes, ma'am. Go ahead and shout out your
I want to follow
name.
up what Tamara said. My
Thank
name is
you.
Pam.
Hi, Pam.
So I think you said in the beginning, and thank you so much for coming, that you have a $1.3 billion payout per year, something like
Yeah,
that.
and
So
benefits.
maybe what my question is, and it leads into my real question is, if 7% of that is whatever, and that's what you need to have to be responsible to the ERS people, whatever that amount is, my question is with regard to the golf course development, what a lot of people don't know and understand is that it still needs to go through a change in zoning, it still's got to go through an EIS, it's still got to go through a community plan amendment, there's a lot of hurdles it's got to go through in an SMA. As a result of all those things, you may not have what you think you're going to get. It may go from here to Mr. Hollywood developer down to here. So if at that point in time, there must be a point in time where you see it's just not economically feasible. So then what happens would be my question.
Fair
Well,
question.
that is a very, very good question. And in fact, you're absolutely right. We don't know what we're going to get. And this, I believe the pursuit of this process is that effort to establish a sense of value. Value for the land, undeveloped as it is today, or with these amenities. And again, because the nature of those amenities hasn't really fully been established yet, that number is moving all the time. And so there are assumptions that underlie what you think you're going to get for housing or retail. But those are all assumptions, and you don't know until after, in some instances, you've invested the money that it's going to be realized. But we try to reduce that uncertainty by the process of underwriting the investment.
I think what I'm trying to get to is that because of the regulations that this project still needs to go through, you may not get that housing.
Indeed, that may
So
be
I'm saying
true.
at that point, do you reach a point where maybe this is not a good idea, this development?
Well,
and let's do something else.
Well,
I'm
I
just
think,
trying to figure out
I
what-
think
yeah,
that
what-
one has to look at alternatives.
Right.
That we don't have a blinders on that says this is
Right.
what we've got to do in order to make this thing work. If we can't make a reasonable return on these investments, then I think the board has to make decisions as to, do we retain it? Do we continue to invest money in the maintenance of it? If it's perhaps, let's just say, it's not making money. Would those monies be deployed better somewhere else? I don't know. But those are the kind of decisions that inevitably get made as we go through this process. So, but we don't have this sense that we will develop this project hell or high water. It has to be reasonable, and it has to provide a return to our beneficiaries, to our members. And if it doesn't do that, then we can't pursue it.
We'll go to, I think this gentleman had his hand up in just a second, but I just want to comment before you ask your question. Tom is pointing out one of the difficulties in managing assets for a fiduciary that needs to do it for the sake of the beneficiaries. And he's absolutely right that that is what should be happening constitutionally. But unfortunately, he lives in a political world. You know that. We have legislators and we have other stakeholders who weigh in with a value structure. So sometimes it's not easy in any trust situation to do what is purely for the sake of the beneficiaries, because there's so many voices, and you are all stakeholders and understand that. Sir, go ahead and tell us your name.
Hi, Gary Weiss. I'm a 15-year full-time resident on Maui. I just have two questions.
Okay, Gary, go ahead.
First of all, is ERS and the board fully aware of the scope of opposition to the Kanapali project? I personally, and many people I know, have sent emails starting over a year ago before we first heard about it, never got any responses. We never hear anything from Honolulu. There is widespread opposition to this project on the west side. There's been multiple standing room only events where all you hear is opposition. The opposition is occurring in every wake of society, in 20-year-olds that are members of Canoe Club to 80-year-old retirees. And so I have two questions. The first is, how much does ERS know that? And I'm asking that because there's a mainland company that's been going around talking to different groups, created a divisive environment because playing different groups against each other, promising people this that they're going to support and then not promising people that. So it's an incredibly divisive process that we're going through. In a mature resort, that really doesn't need any more concrete. Recently, there's been multi-fatality accidents because of the traffic on the other side. All the traffic was diverted through Kaanapali. And, you know, you personally are doing a great job with this fund. The returns over a decade are extraordinary. Unfortunately, I think you guys live in a little vacuum over there, where we as a neighbor island that make this commute every day and depend on this west side single highway, and you're talking about adding thousands more rental cars to the daily traffic. And in 15 years that I've been here, it's been unbelievable what's happened to the traffic. It's a daily bumper-to-bumper H1 experience.
Gary,
So my first question,
good
how
question.
much are you
Your
guys
second
aware of
question?
The opposition to this and what's going on over here.
Thank you, Gary. Go
Well,
ahead.
Thank you. Let me say that this is a very important project to the ERS, and it has monitored very carefully the developments through direct and persistent communications with Low Enterprises, who is the potential developer of the project. They're the manager of the golf course as we speak. And we have folks on the ground here who are communicating back to us. You know, do we have a perfect understanding? I would likely say not. I'm committed to try to enhance that awareness. I would imagine that just as though there is a formidable level of opposition, there may be a kernel of support dependent upon the design. I mean, maybe there's no way to find consensus around any of this, but there are some issues that exist prior to the golf course or any redevelopment. And my sense is that we won't know those impacts until we have the conversations with you. And that's what we're offering, is that conversation through this process. And we may very well end up at a place that I think you have arrived at that says, this is not good for us. This won't be advantageous to the community. But I don't know to get from here to there without having that conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Barry has a question over here.
Hi,
Yes.
Barry. I'm with the, in the ERS system. My question has nothing to do with the golf course. How does the ERS select which investments to go into? Is there a consultant, a private firm, or how does a private firm?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. You know, there are a range of investments. You know, I've talked about the complexity of them. We do have a modest investment staff. We have 3 investment officers and a chief investment officer, but we do employ expert consultants. We have a general consultant, we have a private equities consultant, we have a real estate consultant, and they tend to evaluate hundreds of investment opportunities and bring to the committee and to the board, the investment committee and the board, the best of those opportunities. There is an investment plan that's established every year that we try to move toward. So it's a disciplined process, it's heavily recorded, and it employs professionals not only in our hire, but we have relations with some of the most prominent investment organizations in the world, with the KKRs, with the Blackstones, the BlackRocks, the Carlyles, with all the big banks in the context of economic assumptions and market sectors. What's going to be growing, what's going to be contracting, where are the opportunities globally and otherwise. So it's a very disciplined process. It's not me picking sort of my favorites.
That's right. In fact, one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is that the ERS is about wealth management, about protection of wealth, the growth of wealth, and the appropriate use of that wealth. I've had a glimpse at what that is in the last 9 months as a seated trustee in the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is precisely a trust that is responsible for managing land assets, stock portfolio, and so forth for the sake of beneficiaries. We have time for a few more questions, and I do want to say this, that Gary, thank you for your question earlier, and Thomas and Gwen will be around later on if you want to ask any more questions, particularly about Kaanapali. But we'd like to take a variety of issues as well. So let me, gentleman in the back has been waiting, and then we'll go to this lady.
Hi, my name's Albert. I was just looking, I remember earlier I was asking you about the risks. I like to think that the small amount of money that I have in your pension is invested conservatively. I mean, if you had another stock market crash like we had in 2006, what would happen to your pension? Would it survive?
Yes, it
So,
was.
what I don't see, you said that you had a plan, where can we access that plan? And how much risk is acceptable before you say that's too much? That's my first question. And a related question has to do with that project. But what happened? Why did that loan go bad? What were they trying to do? Why did you guys lend them the money?
Well, we purchase securities. Some of those are debt securities. I wasn't here at the time. I don't know, is it AmFact? I don't remember which the firm that actually went bankrupt, but the golf course was a part of the collateral. But I couldn't begin to tell you the rationale why we lent that particular firm money. But clearly we must have thought it was a good investment. But all investments don't pan out. I mean, it would be great if they were all perfect, but that's just not the case. And we want to try to make a lot more good ones than the bad ones. And that's been our record, quite frankly. You mentioned the market crash in 2008 and 2009. And you also talked about the level of risk you take. Well, the level of risk that you can take and must take really varies considerably based on your fiscal situation. For example, if you're 100% fully funded, you probably don't need to take any risk at all, or very little. There's risk involved with government, with treasury notes. You can achieve much of your return with an over-representation of fixed investments. But if you're underfunded, then you've got to reach a little bit more than if you were fully funded. But at the same time, you can't not take risk and get return. I mean, those two things are intractably connected. I mean, there is a level of risk, and we try to minimize that risk, and we try to invest the monies conservatively. And one of the things that we've done is something called a restructure in our portfolio. It's a crisis risk offset, because if you're fully funded, the next downturn you can endure. You'll be okay. If you're poorly funded, it could bankrupt a fund. It won't bankrupt our fund, but one of the things that we've done to mitigate that is we've created a strategy, and it's going to hold 20% of the portfolio and invest in strategies that perform positively in market declines, sustained market declines. And that's, we are talking about crisis here, and we call that the crisis risk offset. And it's made up of systematic trend following strategies. It's alternate premia investments, as we say, and long bonds. And when markets go down, these tend to perform positively against the market. So we're trying to hedge our bets so that we won't have that kind of decline that we experienced in 2018.
Ma'am?
Where can we access the?
Oh, go ahead.
I believe it's on our website. The investment, the strategies, the portfolio, all of the investments are listed on our website.
And is this one of the items, Thomas, that Gwen could help with?
Well, yeah, we can make we have so many publications, but yes, all of our investment managers, the allocation of assets, which are going to brought here tonight, is available on our website.
Okay, ma'am, thank you for waiting. Appreciate it.
My name is Elaine Gallant, and I live in Maui, so of course, my question relates to it, and I apologize that you cut it off, but unfortunately, there's two.
It's fine. Thank you.
God willing, the project does not go through for those of us who live there. What are your alternatives? What are your other options that you're looking at that could help fund this without the golf course and redevelopment of Maui being part of that?
Well, let me say, that's a very good question, and I don't think we're at that point of having exhausted or explored all of our alternatives. My sense is that these are some recommended approaches toward achieving a solid return. But again, if this does not move forward, if there's a failure to achieve the necessary permitting, or there's oppositions of such a degree that it doesn't make it viable for us to do, we will look at alternatives. But I wouldn't want to say what those are because we haven't actually identified them yet. But, you know, could we sell the property to someone else? Because, I mean, that's always an option, but the ERS has elected not to do that at this juncture because it wanted to be the steward of this property, recognizing its importance to this community.
We have time for just two more real fast questions, if you'll keep them. This gentleman over here, and then that gentleman over there, and then afterward, Thomas will be around for further questions. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Alan, and I want to ask a question about the return that you showed on the real estate component. It had 13% as sort of the expectation that within your 7.5% or 7% overall that you're going to achieve. When you think about the Kaanapali situation, originally the debt was about 70 million. My understanding it's been paid down to about 26 million. So do you think of the 13% return on 26 or 13% on the original 70? Or how do you look at that?
Yeah, again, that's a good question, and it's a level of analysis that I'm really not prepared to respond to. We look at real estate investments, and there's not a single rate of return that we're expecting because we have different types of investments. You know, there's commercial, there's residential, multifamily, hospitals, senior care, a whole range, and they all provide different levels of return. And I'm personally not familiar with what the expected return from the Kaanapali course is.
Our last question. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Jeff. Just like to confirm that the changes that was done in the legislature, the past ledge, that upped the contribution requirements from the employer. Did I see that chart correctly, that that will go till 2041? Was that just a 4-year increase, or is that an increase that's going to carry until such time that we reach 100%?
The contribution increase is expected to be permanent. So it was not sort of a one-time, and then it goes back to the former level. It was a constant. Once it achieves the 24% in terms of employer contribution, general employees, it stays there until it's fully funded. And that was forecast to be that 2046 or thereabouts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Everyone, give Thomas Williams a big hand. I appreciate it. And you know, at the Grassroot Institute, we are watchdogs. If you saw the Honolulu Star Advertiser this morning, we came out with evidence that the city of Honolulu actually made a case for more funding with false information. And we were willing enough to go out and point a finger. So if you read the Honolulu Star Advertiser this morning, that's front page news. And it impacts you because out here on Maui, you're ending up paying for the Honolulu rail system, so you should have a stake in that. And I just mentioned this because in the spirit of trying to hold government accountable, I also want to be fair. Thomas is the chief employee of the ERS, which means he's the expert who runs things. So I was so glad he was willing to come here to be able to give the best explanations. But when it comes to setting policies, such as ultimate policy with regard to Kaanapali or any other kind of issue, it's the board that does that. With that said, go a little light on him tonight. He's a good guy. And we need public servants like that as well. So give Thomas Williams another big hand. Thank you very much.
And from the Grassroot Institute, aloha. You'll find a copy of this on our website, and we hope that you'll become avid readers of the research and work done by Grassroot Institute. I'm Keli'i Akina. Thank you for being here tonight. Aloha. One more announcement.
Well, yeah, just let me say in closing, I think that I mentioned that article, our newsletter that has an article in it on Kaanapali, and I think Gwen has a Q&A that relates to the development. It's not going to answer all of your questions, obviously, but it's the best information that's available based on the moment. And to the extent you have more questions, take these and then raise those questions back with Gwen and Michael, who will get them to our board.
And thank you. And by the way, you were all a civil audience tonight, and should congratulate yourself.
Thank you
very
Thank
much.
you.